This is Love Notes, daily devotions from Holy Trinity Lutheran Church. Grace and peace to you. We move now into the 29th chapter of Job, and it tells us that Job again took up his discourse. That's one of the clues that scholars use, that maybe the 28th chapter and maybe even the 27th chapter were insertions of some kind, attributed to someone else. That doesn't mean they don't follow in the flow of this particular book as a whole. But here, for certain, we turn back to what Job has to say. And what Job does in this chapter is long for the past. He looks back on what his life was like before the suffering fell on him. Oh, that I were as in the months of old, as in the days when God watched over me. Implication, God is not watching over me now. When his lamp shone over my head, and by his light I walked through darkness. When I was in my prime, when I was young. When the friendship of God was upon my tent. When the Almighty was still with me. When my children were around. Job looks back to the past. He's longing for it. There is a goodness of his past life that he wishes was still the case. And so he's grieving what he's lost. He's grieving his youth. He's grieving the losses. He's grieving the presence of God as something that was very real to him. We might ask ourselves, in what way was God present to him? Was it just because he wasn't suffering that he felt God present? Maybe that's true for us too. When times are good, it's easy to think that God is with us. But it's also easy when times are good to forget about God completely and assume that everything comes from us. Job didn't do that. Job was very thankful and blameless before God in his gratitude. He cries out, when my children were around me, and we can only have our hearts break for Job, who still grieves the loss of all of his family. He continues on in verse 7 and following to reflect back on the day when he had respect in the community, when he took his seat in the square and young men saw him as somebody to seek out for answers, who nobles, rulers refrained from talking to, laid their hands on their mouths because they were not Job's equal, when they were hushed because of his wisdom and his insight. Job thinks back to the time when he was respected, and as we have seen in all the chapters of the dialogues, Job has no respect from anyone anymore. He's suffering. Is that a statement about how the world really is? We don't respect people who seem to be losers. Somebody was once rich and they lose their fortune, we think, well, we shouldn't have trusted in them. Somebody gets sick and we wonder what they did wrong. Even as we treat the elderly and we see their health subside, we can look at them and say, well, they once used to be valuable and now they're not. As we build more and more warehouses for the old, we don't seem to have any regard or respect for them. And Job has lost all of that. He longs for the day when he is, again, respected, well known, where his wisdom is counted upon. In verse 14, he says, I put on righteousness like a cloak. It clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. In other words, justice and righteousness were the outside signs of his life, not his royal robes and his rings and his jewelry. He said, I was eyes to the blind, I was feet to the lame. I was a father to the needy, and I championed the cause of the stranger. Job is making a case here that he was an upright and righteous man, which is what God said of him in the very beginning. Job didn't neglect the poor. This may be an answer to his friends who kept saying, come on, you must have done something wrong. I broke the fangs of the unrighteousness. I made them drop their prey from their teeth. In other words, I defended the innocent, those who were being set upon. When that was the state of his life, verse 18 tells us, I thought to myself, I shall die in my nest. When I die, I'll be in my home, my surroundings, and I shall multiply my days like the phoenix rising from the ashes. My roots spread out to the waters, and the dew all night on my branches. In other words, I will live in comfort, and I will die in comfort. They listened to me. They waited and kept silence. They waited for me as for the rain. They opened their mouths as for the spring rain. I smiled on them when they had no confidence. I built them up. I was a good man. That's what Job seems to be saying here. In some ways, there are marks of this that are a bit like the third chapter of Job, where Job states his case in bitterness and anger, but there's a change that's taken place. The bitterness of chapter 3 has become gratitude and longing for what he had. And I wonder if there's not a lesson there in how we process the suffering of our life. We grieve the loss of all the good things. But there must come a point where our bitterness gives way to something different, something transformative. And maybe in his questioning of God, maybe in his constant defense of his position, maybe in his yearning for God to end the suffering and restore him, Job has come to a place where he can give thanks for all that he had. He can remember with some fondness the way things were. Job claims his righteousness. He is not shy about that, and many of us have a false humility that we claim, but he claims his righteousness. But Job has not gotten stuck in a kind of emotional reaction to his situation. His reflection has given him deeper insight into himself, if not God. His questions remain. His loss is still stinging. But Job has continued to ponder, to engage, to meditate upon what it is that's happened. And in that process, Job seems to have changed. I think there's a lesson there. We too need to engage our suffering, not run away from it. We need to seek to understand it, not to dismiss it and accept whatever self-help books are out there. In this self-reflection, Job has been transformed. Maybe God's withholding of answers allows the space for that. Maybe we should remember that. Amen.